Jordan Peterson. I used to be his fan back in the day when he was still giving psychology lectures and recommending great books. But something is different now. My opinion is that he used to be very cool, and step by step he became more and more cringe. But this leads us to a deeper sociological question. What makes something or someone cool, and what is the meaning of cringe? We will use the strange case of the decline of Jordan Peterson to try to answer this question. I discovered Peterson somewhere around 2017, but I only started to get into his lectures and books around 2019. And what can I say about them? They are pretty good. He recommends some awesome books, like the Gulag Archipelago, and it is obvious that he knows his shit when it comes to psychology. His political career was kick-started after his 15 minutes of fame and controversy when he opposed Bill C-16. But during these first years, he mostly stuck to psychology, philosophy, and even his books were mostly centered around self-help. When he did address political issues, he did so from a psychological and frankly mature point of view that you would come to expect from a therapist. He represented a figure that had the ability to cover political topics from a common sense point of view, or at least something that is not typical. Simply put, he was cool, and like all cool things, he became popular. His books sold incredibly well, and he went on speaking tours all over the place, not to mention many podcasts and interviews. This is not to say that his politics were impeccable. Quite the opposite. Many of his positions were nothing more than your local basic bitch liberalism, even though he was also portrayed as a radical. However, this radicalism was nowhere to be seen in these interviews, especially the one with Kathy Newman. This gave him the role of the underdog, of a soft-spoken professor that speaks in common sense. And what really made him unique is that he also engaged in psychological and even philosophical topics, as well as politics. When we contrast this with your average politician that has zero depth, it is very logical why he became so popular. Even the normies could not get enough of this guy. But something changed, didn't it? Something is different now. I cannot point out when this change occurred, but it is doubtless that it did. And it may very well be that it was me who changed and not Jordan. But you can judge for yourself. So let's look at the last 3 tweets that he posted while I was writing this essay, shall we? In any case, when I look at the new content that Peterson makes, I simply do not feel the same admiration that I still feel when revisiting his old lectures for this essay. I think there are a few reasons why, at least for me, Jordan Peterson has lost his touch. I think that the most evident one is that he has changed his style. He is no longer a professor at a university who speaks his mind from time to time. Now he's a complete political pundit, and he is even part of the Daily fucking Wire. And indeed, in his Twitter, you will not see a single thing about psychology. It is all politics and culture warring. But as seen in the tweets above, this means mainly complaining. In my professional opinion, I think that is pretty cringe. But this brings us to the central question of this essay. What makes something cringe or cool? My definition is very simple. Something is cool when it gives the individual power, and everything that is cringe is something that will take this power away. This is because power is always cool, and everybody wants it. I admit that my view of human nature is very egotistical, but I think that all our actions are driven by individual desires, and these desires can only be fulfilled when we have power. The attraction that one feels towards someone cool or something cool comes from the desire to have more power in one's life. Everybody is attracted to the things that promise them more power, but because each person has a different conception of what these things are, we all have different opinions of what is cool. Indeed, if you want to know the character of a person, you might look at what they think is cool and you might learn a lot. But what is this power thing? Power is to have control over yourself and other people. Respectively, there are two types of power: influence, which is power over other people, and competence, which is power over your own actions. Both of which are pretty cool by themselves, and together they are the coolest thing there is. Once we have defined cool, it's very easy to explain cringe. It is just the opposite of cool. The opposite of influence is irrelevance, and the opposite of competence is incompetence. These two components of cringe result in a person that has no power over his own actions and much less the actions of others. Seen from this lens, cringe is a defensive reaction against the things and behaviors that will take away our individual and social power. In a very similar way that disgust is also a defensive mechanism against possible disease. Competence can be defined as the ability to control your own life. Being competent at something means that you have control over it. For example, the difference between a competent driver and an incompetent one is that one is in control of the car and the other one is not. And I think that it is not a generalization to say that everybody wants to be in control of their own life, to be independent. But this can only happen as a result of knowing what you are doing. There are a lot of things that you have to master to be a person that is in control of their own life. However, there are two that are especially important. One is professional competence, and the other one is social competence. Professional competence is the ability of doing something well, and it would also not be very controversial to say that we all want to be competent at our jobs. Since we desire competence, we also come to admire competence in others. For example, we cannot help but admire the mastery that an athlete commands over their own body. We are drawn to it because we all wish we had such dexterity and strength. The other sort of competence that is extremely important is social competence. It is the ability to understand the people who are around you and the situation that you are in. Normally, we call people who have high social competence charismatic. Again, we admire people who are charismatic. This is because humans are still social creatures, and the person with a silver tongue can get very far in life. A large percentage of the attitudes that we consider to be cool are just ways to signify competence. For example, the reason that all teenagers love to be rebels is because it signifies that said teenager is competent enough to disobey directly their teacher, their parents, and even the law, and that makes being a rebel cool. Our collective admiration of competence is also reflected in the sort of protagonist that we see in most movies and books. He is brave, talented, and resourceful. He has good friends, attractive romantic partners, and always has something witty to say. All of these things show high social and professional competence, and we are drawn to it. But everything in this world has an equal and opposite reaction. If you feel attracted to competence, you will also feel repulsed by incompetence. In other words, if you find some things cool, you will also find other things cringe. A famous Middle Eastern philosopher said, "When people see a strong horse and a weak horse, by nature they will like the strong horse." And I think that there is something very true about that statement. Nobody likes incompetence. We might feel pity for it, even compassion at times, but nobody wants to be professionally or socially incompetent. In fact, we avoid it like the plague. All the situations that produce cringe show somebody that is professionally incompetent or socially incompetent. In the case of professional incompetence, we feel this cringe when we see something that is so badly done that it hurts to look at it. However, the worst sort of cringe is the one that comes out of social incompetence, out of somebody who does not understand what is going on at a social level, and simply put, they don't get it. A funny example of this is when an adult tries to be hip with the teenagers. It shows that this adult really does not understand that they're not 17 anymore. Seeing an adult being socially inept and begging for the acceptance of teenagers is frankly pathetic, and it shows a lack of social competence and therefore is cringe. The most extreme version of this is somebody that has zero social skills and simply cannot interact with other humans. The best example are incels. They are so socially inept that almost everything they do is doomed to be cringe. But the main reason for us to cringe at incompetence is that we are very much afraid of being incompetent ourselves. We might be good at our jobs and have a great friend group, but this does not change the fact that everybody is afraid of not being good enough. We avoid examples of incompetence in order not to become incompetent ourselves. And I think it is worth repeating that this is a defense mechanism. Our reaction to an incel is a social equivalent of our reaction towards somebody with leprosy. However, coolness and cringe are not only present in social settings, but in political ones too, and luckily they have the same formula. Political power is the control of the actions of other people, and in order to do this, you need influence. To have influence means that you are in a position where you can control the actions of other people, and this sort of power feels good. And you can see this in how much it gets government bureaucrats off. Their lives and jobs might suck, but they still get a kick out of ordering you around. Influence might come from force. Empty the cash register if you want to live is a very persuasive argument, and indeed, it is the reason why people find weapons, tanks, and planes so intriguing. They represent influence over other people through force and are therefore cool. Indeed, the influence of most political institutions is based on force. You don't want to pay your taxes? Please follow the officer to the vehicle, and don't try to resist, otherwise you might get very, very hurt. However, it is not normal to see armed police going door to door to personally collect taxes, because most people believe that they should be paying taxes. After all, they have been brought up to be good, responsible citizens. This is because influence primarily comes through ideas instead of force. If you can control how someone thinks, you can also control their actions. This is where the political power of politicians and pundits come from. Their propaganda reaches millions of people, and therefore they have indirect power over them. For example, most Germans in 1940 agreed with National Socialism, and this was not because the Gestapo paid them a weekly visit to make sure that they were faithful to the party. Instead, it was because they had been exposed to 7 years of Nazi propaganda and had come to accept those ideas as correct. Therefore, Goebbels alone had more political power than all the brown shirts combined. So by definition, any person with a large audience is influential. But this also depends on another factor, and that is prestige. There are people who make better quality content and therefore more people trust them. Prestige gives institutions a decisive advantage over individuals. When they fuck up, it would not kill the whole institution, but instead a single career. This is why most influence is to be found inside institutions like universities, corporations, newspaper, etc., the usual suspects. The opposite of influence is irrelevance. This is pretty simple. You have no power over anyone in society or politics. You simply do not matter. This is a state that most of us find ourselves in. This is normal for us. But for politicians, journalists, and ideologies, irrelevance means death. To use the Nazis as an example again, neo-Nazis are super fucking cringe because they are microscopically irrelevant. They can barely hold a job and they still have pretensions about saving the Aryan race. Although it has to be said that influence and irrelevance are what makes something politically cool, not politically effective. There have been many movements that were very cool and still ended up failing. Once this happens, the movement will lose its influence because it will become obvious that it is going nowhere. Or why do you think that Soviet teens listened to rock and wore jeans? Competence and influence are not always together. A government bureaucrat has no competence, but quite a lot of influence. A hermit living in the woods must be competent enough to survive, but also has no influence over society. When these two combine, they make a person that is professional, charismatic, and influential. In other words, they make a leader. Nothing is cooler than that. Well, this essay is still about Peterson, right? So, what can we say about him based on his level of influence and competence? Peterson was cool because he was competent and influential. He was competent because he was an academic who knew his stuff. You cannot look at his psychology lectures without seeing his insight into the human psyche. His competence was the reason why so many people started to follow him, and his prestige was the key to his influence. However, I think that his quality has suffered since because of two factors. Number one, he has shifted from being an academic to being a pundit. This means that he is no longer in his field of expertise. He is no longer a psychology professor commenting about politics. Instead, he is just another pundit. Nothing differentiates him from your standard lib-turned-conservative, and therefore his quality has dropped massively. If you look at his Twitter, it is literally him just complaining about politics. There is not a single mention of psychology. The thing with complaining is that it is not cool. Teenagers that can't go to a party complain. If Jordan B. Peterson or any other conservative would have power, they would not complain, they would act, but they are powerless. What makes this cringe is that they do not realize that they are powerless. They do not understand the position that they are in. That being said, there are some redeeming features to Jordan Peterson, to the new Jordan Peterson. One of them is his podcast, where he covers some non-political topics from time to time. And the other one is that he is still a very talented speaker. The second reason why his quality has dropped is that he has become more impulsive, and he has committed some very embarrassing mistakes. The biggest example of this is again his Twitter. I think that it is very hypocritical for a person that has said, quote, "I choose my words very, very carefully," to go ahead and tweet this. How the fuck am I supposed to take him seriously as an intellectual when he spends all day in Twitter complaining and accidentally retweeting BDSM porn? Because he is a single intellectual, a couple of mistakes can cost him his prestige, and without his prestige, he can be very easily dismissed. This is cringe because dumb, low-quality posts damage his reputation and by extension, his influence. He might have a very shiny new contract with Shapiro, but on the whole, Jordan Peterson has become less and less competent, and if this trend continues, he will also become increasingly irrelevant. In other words, he is losing power. As long as he was a competent professor who engaged carefully with political issues, he was almost untouchable. Newman definitely tried her best to dismiss and slander him, and it failed spectacularly. His biggest strength used to be that he was a calm, educated professor that made sensible arguments, and I simply do not see that anymore. Instead, all that I see is this boomer cringe. I suspect that the reason for this change is that Peterson has become integrated in the conservative movement, and conservatives have the idea that if they complain hard enough and point out how crazy the left is, the average person will finally join them and the madness will end. There are two major problems with this. The first is that Nixon's silent majority is a myth, and the second is that conservative intellectuals have to dumb themselves down and focus on the issues that will get a large response from the Fox News crowd. This strategy makes sense because it works. It will attract more viewers, however, it will be intellectually sterile. This sort of content is a product of incompetence, and it is doomed to future irrelevance. The thing is that Peterson became so prominent because he was not a part of the political grift. In his case, quality triumphed over quantity. But now he has traded his role as an intellectual for the role of a mediocre pundit. It would be incorrect to call him incompetent or irrelevant, because he is still very talented and has a very large audience, but he is not as competent or relevant as he once was. That is not enough to make him cringe, but just a little. I will never forgive conservatism for what it did to Jordan Peterson.